Anyone who's been around sales immediately recognises this image. It's a pipeline or a funnel. The problem of turning demand into revenue, into cash. The problem of getting as many of those potential buyers through that pipeline to become actual buyers, customers or clients. As this simple graphic illustrates, that means getting the buyers to traverse through 4 domains or regions of the pipeline. There are more, but 4 will do to keep the illustration from getting more complicated than it needs to be. First, buyers need to be made aware and attracted. Increasingly, this is the domain of social media, often integrated across other channels such as traditional advertising, PR and the like. Having attracted them, they cross into the marketing domain, where they are communicated with and nurtured down through the pipeline with increasingly targeted messaging depending on who they are, where they are, and what they do. Once they've progressed far enough, and usually that will mean having been qualified to some degree, the buyers move into the sales part of the process, where they are actively engaged in a meaningful sales conversation. Bearing in mind that this conversation can be, and in the age of COVID-19, increasingly is, happening digitally. The degree of human interaction is decreasing rather rapidly, being replaced by bots and other forms of artificial intelligence. The key point, though, is that from the buyer's perspective, they are still passing through the sales part of the pipeline. And the more digital and data-based that passage becomes, the more telemetry comes into its own. Finally, those that make it all the way exit the sales pipeline as customers or clients, and the purchasing transactions they consummate are recorded in the finance systems, in the general ledger. Now, we're just going to tip that pipeline over onto its side to help with the illustration. As buyers move through their buying journeys, they interact with marketers and sellers, and as they engage in those interactions, they leave data trails in the system they interact with. While they're in the upper reaches of the pipeline, they're interacting with social platforms and applications such as these. We've all heard about the power of platforms like Facebook to gather and harvest personal data. When they get into the marketing section, they're interacting with marketing automation platforms such as the ones illustrated here. In the sales section, they're in the domain of CRMs, with Salesforce, the most recognisable of the 600-pound gorillas. And finally, they reach the general ledgers. Telemetry clicks onto all and any of those platforms and applications like a big Lego brick, and extracts, translates and maps the data about the buyers and what they've been doing into a multi-stage pipeline model that traverses the entire process from start to finish. More than 98% of that data is currently not being used at all. It's created and stored and then never seen again. Telemetry harvests the pipeline-relevant data, and the algorithms mine it for risk and performance-based insights, which can then be surfaced using telemetry's own inbuilt dashboards, or shared with whatever visualization tools or dashboards the organisation is using, including Excel. So that, at a very high level, is what telemetry does. Let's have a look at it in action. The process starts with the ingestion of data from whatever underlying systems we're looking at. In the interest of time, we've preloaded datasets from an Eloqua marketing automation system and Oracle CRM on demand and merged them together in a simple flat CSV file in Excel. Here's what that data file actually looks like. The ingestion can also take some time depending on the size of the merged data files. We can be looking at tens or even hundreds of thousands of individual records, so we've also preloaded that in the interests of time. The file upload function is where we point telemetry at the data file and upload it into the system. Of course, this can all be done via APIs once the system is in place and running live. The first thing we see is the pipeline end-to-end, mapped from whatever the underlying systems are into telemetry's 10-stage buyer's journey model. This is all customizable. Our standard is 10 steps, but it can be 3 or 4 or 20, depending on how the organisation wants to set it up. In the first column, above and below, we have the population of the pipeline mapped from beginning to end, by value above and volume below. According to Salesforce, IBM and Deloitte, there isn't another system in the world that can presently do this cross-domain or cross-platform, if you like. We are bridging what is typically at least 4 separate domains and aggregating the data into one pipeline view. The starting point for the analysis, therefore, is a full end-to-end snapshot of the leads, suspects, prospects, opportunities, whatever term you prefer. We like buyers. Of the buyers currently sitting in the pipeline across marketing and sales. You cannot get this insight just from a CRM, nor from a marketing automation or other system. Even so-called integrated systems from the same vendors do not provide this level of insight. Telemetry then calculates a first set of stage conversion metrics in the column titled Conversion Percent, and a cumulative calculation of pipeline conversion in the column to the left of it. The data usually gives us enough information to calculate an initial set of velocities. How long does it take for the buyers who convert from one stage to the next to achieve that conversion? The standard measure is days, but this can just as easily be seconds, minutes, or even years. It all depends on who's buying, what they're buying, and how they're buying it. Organisations are rarely thinking about recycling their pipeline leakage before we meet them. By recycling, we mean the rate at which buyers who leak from the process at the various stages, the pipeline attrition in other words, is recycled or fed back into the system. This might be happening occasionally or accidentally, but it's rarely systematic or part of a process. For the purposes of establishing a baseline, we typically assume that a company will be able to recycle 5% of the buyers who leak out at each stage in the top half of the pipeline back into the system, and 10% for the lower half. The remaining 95% and 90% respectively are assumed lost forever. It's pretty conservative, but it's safe. Recycle velocity refers to how quickly we plan on recycling the buyers that we recycle. And so from one single slice of data through the pipeline, telemetry has baselined the current performance of the entire system from end to end. Between this and the initial pipeline population model, we have a snapshot of what's actually in the pipeline and how well it's operating at this moment in time. Whether that's good or bad or better or worse, we'll get to in a few moments. Telemetry now applies the conversion, velocity, and recycling performance metrics to the buyers currently scattered across the pipeline and extrapolates out into the future, predicting what will be in the pipeline and what it will produce by way of output months into the future. That system forecasts throughput and output based on latest available data. Telemetry allows for filtering of pipeline data that can literally be almost infinite. Pipeline filters are different dimensions to the pipeline data. In this demonstration, the client has 3 products, meaning that each product has its own pipeline. Each of the products are sold in 3 territories, so each product and territory combination will have its own pipeline. From the initial data ingestion, telemetry has produced a pipeline performance baseline and an initial set of extrapolated forecasts out into the future for both pipeline output and throughput. It can also compare telemetry's data-based forecasts with the traditional Excel last year plus 10% budgets. Roll forward 1 month and we're ingesting the second data set, same as last month, just 30 days further on. The pipeline conversion and velocity metrics are updated, and here's where things start getting interesting. In the upper frame on the screen, you can see the system has recalibrated the performance metrics and applied those metrics to the updated end-to-end pipeline population, and recalculated the monthly throughput and output forecasts into the future. You can see how every figure in the forward extrapolations has changed, often not by much, but they have all changed. Telemetry has also compared this latest resulting extrapolation with the previous one from last month. In the lower frames, you'll see that differences or deltas have opened up for the months into the future. Positive deltas, that is months where the latest prediction is an improvement on the last one, are shaded green where that difference or delta is more than 3%. Negative deltas of more than 3% are shaded red, between 3% higher or lower are shaded amber. This analysis reveals a negative delta totaling $382,000 has opened up, and most of it is going to hit 9 to 10 months from now. The good news, and the whole point of this intelligence is, we have some time to intervene and possibly close that gap. We won't have to wait until it's literally right in front of us before we even know it's there, leaving us with no time to react. This is the Forward Risk Radar, the Pipeline MRI. This visual is highlighting the projected gaps, unders and overs, in conversation and velocity for each stage of the pipeline for every month in the coming year. Just like traffic lights, green is good, red not so good, and amber is somewhere in between. You can see for yourself all the red that's opened up in the last quarter of the year. What we're going to do now is illustrate the power of marginal gain theory to deliver huge gains in overall revenue output from small incremental changes to the process. In this case, we're going to intervene and improve conversion at stage 4 by 1% in December and another 1% in January. We can't do anything about November because that's already actual data and obviously can't be changed. What we're doing here is the pipeline equivalent of the butterfly effect, which is a key part of chaos theory. Supposedly, where the butterfly flapping its wings can trigger a hurricane on the other side of the world, which sounds ridiculous, but it's actually consistent with the principles of quantum mechanics. Before we see the effect of improving performance in those 2 months by 1%, we just need to digress for a few moments and talk about marginal gain theory, which is one of the fundamental building blocks of Telemetry RT3 and Revenue Tech's pipeline improvement model. This equation shows how if I get 1% better at something every day for a whole year, I'll be 38 times as good as I was when I started. It's exactly the same principle as compound interest, by the way, which Albert Einstein once described as the most powerful force in the universe. Unfortunately, it works just as well in reverse. If I get 1% worse at something every day, after a year I'll find myself in a world of hurt. In the context of this demonstration, however, which is making marginal gains in pipeline performance, it's a bit more realistic to think in terms of 1% monthly improvements over, say, 3 years. Whichever way you look at the equation, it's a powerful illustration of the power of making incremental improvements over time. Of course, the more things you can find to improve, the shorter the time required for any given improvement target. Incidentally, Sir David Brailsford employed exactly this model to turn Great Britain into a consistent powerhouse in global cycling since the 2008 Beijing Olympics. So, now let's see how telemetry harnesses and applies that power of marginal gain theory to deliver disproportional gains in overall revenue output from small incremental improvements to the process. In this case, we're intervening at stage 4, where the current conversion is 66.31%. And let's assume we can improve that by 1% to 67.31%. For anyone who's had exposure to chaos theory and Edward Lorenz, what you're about to see is the pipeline equivalent of the butterfly effect, which, contrary to popular mythology, has nothing to do with butterflies flapping their wings and triggering hurricanes on the other side of the world. Although Lorenz did originally develop his theories while trying to predict the weather. Rather, the butterfly effect is the sensitive dependence on initial conditions in which a small change in one state of a deterministic nonlinear system can result in much larger differences in a later state, which, without wanting to ruin the end to the story, is what you're about to see. Look what's happened to our forward risk radar from that single marginal improvement at stage 4. The change has flowed through the maths of the entire system, changed the profile of the radar, but most importantly, reduced our $366,000 aggregate deficit to December 2021 to $34,000. Here in the extrapolation, we can see the financial impact more clearly. Okay, so we just wiped out a $380,000 forward deficit with a 1% improvement. I wonder what would happen if we could do that again. That is, if we could make a second 1% improvement. 67.31% goes up to 68.31%. The butterfly effect flows the second 1% through the risk radar, and what was a $38,000 deficit is now a $139,000 overall improvement in the year to December 2021. Shown here in the extrapolation. It's worth remembering that we're talking about a baseline total forecast of $13.9 million, so $385,000 represents 3% of that total. Still, it illustrates the power of 1% increments to deliver 3 to 4 times that in overall improvement when aggregated. Here's a view of the 3 comparative forward risk radars and the 3 corresponding pipeline extrapolations. What if, instead, we decided to intervene at stage 8, where the baseline conversion is only 22.12%? We improve that by 1% to 23.12%. And the $366,000 deficit is gone immediately, replaced by a $185,000 overall improvement. That's a gain of 4% from a single 1% increment. Here's the corresponding extrapolation. And if we add another 1% to stage 8, wow, $522,000. How can that be? Well, essentially because 1% of 22% is quite a bit more than 1% of 66%. Also remember, on a baseline of $13.9 million, it's still 6%. However, it is what it is. I guess we can see why banks make so much money. The simple power of compound interest. Here again is the extrapolation. What happens when we tweak velocity? While it's pretty well impossible in practical terms to influence velocity without affecting conversion at the same time, let's just pretend for the purposes of this demonstration that we can. Here we'll adjust the pipeline velocity to accelerate it by 7%, from 178 days to begin with to 165 days, an improvement of 13 days or 7.3%. Here's the resulting forward risk radar, where we can see the initial deficit of $366,000 has fallen to $65,000. And here's the corresponding extrapolation. Let's see what happens when we adjust the rate at which we recycle the pipeline leakage. Initially, we had it set at 5%. Let's increase that to 50%, which remember means we're capturing half of the buyers who failed to convert from each stage to the next back into the system, which means we're still failing to recycle 50%. The results are staggering. No red in sight. Now, this is obviously an orchestrated change, but it serves to illustrate the incredible power of recycling as a lever of risk and performance. When you look at the underlying maths, it shouldn't really surprise us. A 1% reduction in leakage or increase in recycling from a pipeline that leaks 98% of its volume isn't really that much. It's 1/98th, which is 1.02%. But if that 1% improves end-to-end conversion from 2 to 3%, that's a 1 in 2 or 50% improvement. Of course, it isn't actually quite that simple in practice because, for one thing, we need to factor in time, but the principle is sound enough. And that is the power of marginal improvements. And here's the extrapolation of that improvement in recycling. Telemetry's continuous performance and risk analysis helps organisations identify which stages of their pipeline potentially present the most critical and/or the most attractive opportunities for improvements to conversion, velocity, recycling, or all three. The next step is to look at what the resulting tactical interventions necessary to activate those improvements might look like. Wouldn't it be good to be able to identify at the tactical level which of the available options represents the optimum mix of return, risk, cost and effort? Ideally, what you want are those individual changes that stand to deliver the biggest pipeline performance and output improvement while simultaneously exposing the organisation to the least risk, minimising cost and requiring the least effort. With that in mind, let's have a look at Telemetry RT3's Tactical Selection and Prioritization analysis. Everything in Telemetry is arranged and structured around the stages in the buyer's journey. Here's the main menu for the performance blueprints, and on the right side of the screen you can see again the 10 stages in our standard buyer's journey template. These can be configured, by the way, to align with how an organisation wants to set things up. Ideally, the stages in Telemetry mirror the stages in the marketing automation, CRM and GL systems. Let's have a look inside the Identify Problem stage. The first being produce content from clients and experts about relevant pain, that is, rational and emotional drowning. The second, create mini-surveys to monitor client readiness, identify key concerns / problems / issues, and so on. The base library is continually updated for tactics being used by clients on the system around the world. It's entirely up to the individual client to select and prioritise tactics based on their own pipeline performance and risk profiles, which we'll get to in a moment or two. We now drill down into the tactical library, where the 7 tactics for this stage have been ranked in a 3-dimensional matrix with impact or value on the vertical axis, risk on the horizontal axis, which is the risk to the organisation of implementing the tactic, and cost represented by the relative size of the blue circles. Telemetry prioritises tactics represented by small circles positioned to the upper right, just like the Gartner Magic Quadrant. So in terms of relative attractiveness as tactical options for this client, the 3 circles furthest to the upper right corner would make the optimum interventions. However, there's one more factor we need to consider, and that is the organisation's capability to execute that tactic or those tactics well. In the same way as it makes no sense to give someone the keys to a car if they can't drive, it similarly doesn't make a lot of sense for an organisation to select a tactic or tactics unless it has sufficient capability to do them properly. A company that's hopeless at sales management, for example, might think about starting off with something that doesn't rely on being good at sales management. The box on the right of the screen shows each individual tactic correlated to the drivers in the performance and risk heat map that affect the tactic. Not all the drivers correlate equally, but if a driver correlates strongly and the organisation is weak on that driver, then it might mean that it should select another tactic. In that case, selection also depends on how quickly the organisation can improve on its weaknesses. But that kind of subjective assessment is beyond Telemetry's current functionality. Every tactic in the Telemetry TIL, or Tactical Implementation Library, is ranked in the system against the global VRC matrix, value, risk, cost. Those global scores are currently the average scores across all the clients who have employed the tactics. Future releases will compile and average those tactical VRC scores by industry, organisation size, geography and other relevant dimensions. But every client's performance and risk profile is different, and making decisions based on what some global or even industry average score says is patently silly. So Telemetry assesses and benchmarks each organisation's customised risk and performance heat maps. A mixture of qualitative, quantitative, structured and unstructured data is gathered and assessed to build heat maps that quantify and visually represent an organisation's own profile. Heat map profiles can be produced from different functions within a company. Here's one from a sales function. Versus sales operations. Versus marketing. Versus the board. which in this case might be a tad detached from the reality on the ground, given how much green they think exists compared with the sales ops and marketing teams. Every individual person within an organisation can produce their own heat map profile based on their perspective. The COVID pandemic is still far from over, and exactly how it plays out from here remains uncertain. One thing that is certain, however, is the need for companies to extract every precious dollar of revenue from their sales pipelines. After 15 years, including the last global recession, we've proven time and again that telemetry's analytical insights, coupled with marginal game theory, can do exactly that and unlock vast amounts of potential revenue that has previously gone to waste. If you'd like to learn how to tilt the sales odds in your favour and make your pipeline much more resilient to shocks such as COVID, and lift your revenue output significantly and consistently, visit us at www.revenuetech.com.